October 18, 1955, the lifeless bodies of 3 young boys were discovered unclothed in a drainage ditch. These boys were Robert Peterson, aged 14, John Schuessler, aged 13, and Anton Schuessler, aged 11. This tragic event had a profound and lasting impact on the community. The relentless pursuit of justice was met with frustration as the case remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades. The question lingered. Who could have committed such a horrific crime against these innocent boys? How were they able to elude justice for such an extended period of time? Let us transport ourselves back to the 1950s and explore the hidden gem of Chicago's northwest side. Norwood Park and Jefferson Park, nestled within this district, provided solace for those seeking refuge from the chaos of urban living. The close-knit community revolved around its parish, little league, and bowling alleys. With the lowest crime rate in the city, it was an idyllic place to raise a family until tragedy struck in 1955. On February 11, 1942, in Cook County, Chicago, Malcolm and Dorothy Peterson joyfully welcomed their firstborn, Robert, affectionately known as Bobby. Robert was the eldest of 4 siblings, with younger sisters Barbara Ann, aged 7, and Susan, aged 5, as well as a 3-year-old brother named Tommy. Even as a child, Robert was recognized for his tidiness and meticulousness, ensuring his room was always immaculate. He was a responsible young man who not only assisted at home, but also actively participated in various community endeavors. John Schuessler, born on November 30, 1941, to Anton John Schuessler Sr. and Eleanor Lillian Holtz Schuessler, possessed a deep passion for sports from a tender age. He was an exceptional and well-behaved child who steered clear of trouble. 2 years later, on November 12, 1943, his brother Anton John Schuessler, affectionately known as Tony, entered the world. Tony harbored a lifelong aspiration to become a veterinarian, a dream he nurtured from his earliest years. The bond between the 2 brothers was unbreakable, engaging in shared activities and maintaining a close circle of friends. As the sun descended upon the serene streets where John, Anton, and Robert had spent their childhood engaging in sports and exploring their surroundings, an ominous feeling of something sinister and dark permeated the atmosphere. A dreadful event was on the horizon. It was the 16th of October, 1955, a crisp autumn day in Chicago. The 2 young brothers, 13-year-old John and 11-year-old Anton, mounted their bicycles and pedaled their way to their friend Robert's house. Having already assisted their unwell father in hanging a clothesline in the basement, they now had the entire day to themselves. With a burning desire to embark on a daring escapade, John and Anton each possessed $1.25 in cash, eagerly awaiting their plan to secretly venture downtown and catch a movie. This audacious and forbidden adventure was made possible by their 14-year-old friend, Robert, who possessed the necessary expertise and permission to join them. Robert's mother, Dorothy, even aided them in selecting a film, Disney's The African Lion, which they intended to watch at the Loop Theater. Armed with $1.50 in his hand, Robert bid farewell to his parents, adhering to their customary routine of affectionate kisses, and departed from the house with the promise of returning home by 8 p.m. As the night grew darker and the clock struck past 8, panic began to consume both families. There was no trace of the boys, nor were there any phone calls. Eleanor, the mother of John and Anton, made a phone call to the Peterson residence to inquire about the whereabouts of the boys. To Eleanor's astonishment, Dorothy, Robert's mother, revealed that they had set off for downtown, leaving her in a state of shock. The fear intensified when there was no communication from the boys, prompting Dorothy Peterson to contact the police at the Gale Street station around 10 p.m. She conversed with a sergeant who advised the families to reach out to the police again if the boys failed to return within an hour. The sky, which had initially been adorned with a beautiful blue hue when the boys embarked on their adventure, gradually transformed as the day progressed. The stormy night brought forth torrential rainfall, further exacerbating the anxiety that had gripped the neighborhood. In spite of the challenging circumstances, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Schuessler were determined not to give up their search for their missing sons. They meticulously combed through every hamburger establishment along Milwaukee Avenue and even thoroughly checked the Loop Theater, where the boys had intended to watch a movie. However, all their efforts proved fruitless. It seemed as though the boys had vanished without a trace, leaving no option but to involve the police. Despite their children attending the same school and being friends, the Peterson and Schuessler families had never crossed paths or engaged in conversation with one another. It was as if their lives were running parallel, never intersecting. Little did they know that their lives were on the verge of becoming intricately intertwined in a way they could never have anticipated. As the police initiated their search for the missing boys, they inquired about the boys' attire and belongings, hoping to gather any potential clues. They discovered that Robert had been wearing a distinct White Sox jacket, while the other boys were clad in Cubs jackets. But where could they be? The downtown area was several hours away by car, making it unlikely for them to have traveled that far. Perhaps they had spent their money on snacks and were walking back home in the pouring rain. Or maybe they had gone bowling, a favored pastime of the boys. The search persisted as various theories and ideas were discussed, yet the only certainty was the mounting worry of the families involved. As the sun rose on October 17, 1955, the day following the boys' disappearance, the sense of unease within the community intensified. The police were equally perplexed, as they had never encountered a case in that community where a missing child had not been found. Although Robert had skipped school on a few occasions in the past, everyone knew he was responsible and would never abandon Anton and John on their own. The detectives made the decision to visit Farnsworth School on Linder Avenue, where the boys were enrolled in order to determine if the disappearance had any connection to the school. Principal D.W. Thornton recommended exploring the North Branch of the Chicago River in the Forest Preserve due to its history of violent incidents. A year earlier, a high school boy had assaulted a grade school student near the river. The teachers, Mrs. Bernice Jonas and Miss Cecilia Schwachten, were deeply upset and tried to remain composed. Mrs. Jonas speculated that one or two individuals may have been attempting to gain the students' attention in recent days, as reported by some students. The community was gripped with fear, and the detectives understood that if they didn't locate the boys soon, rumors and speculation would cloud the truth. The detectives faced a challenging task ahead. With a population of 60,000 in the area, they had numerous doorbells to ring and a vast region to cover. They recognized the need to narrow down the search locations to improve their chances of success. Consequently, they began by investigating the Loop Theater and reaching out to the bus drivers who were on duty on the day the boys went missing. One driver, Bruno Mancarini, provided a crucial lead. He recalled seeing 3 boys matching the description of Robert, John, and Anton boarding his bus at Berthoud Avenue, displaying their student ID cards. He dropped them off at Lawrence Avenue, where they intended to go to the Jefferson Park recreation alleys for bowling. The issue arose when they didn't request a transfer slip, indicating that they were supposed to disembark at Central near the Peterson home. Perhaps this innocent change of plans triggered a horrifying sequence of events. It appeared that the detectives were finally making progress in their search for the missing boys. Sightings at the bowling alley yielded the next significant lead. Neighbors and relatives confirmed seeing Robert and Anton at Monte Cristo Bowling Alley, where they took a restroom break while John conversed with a neighbor. The boys departed at 8 p.m. after Robert and Anton returned from the restroom. Edward C. Davis, the manager of the alley, provided additional details, shedding light on the boys' activities that day. According to Davis, they had visited the alley twice, once at approximately 3:15 p.m. and again at 7 p.m. However, they were unable to bowl due to their lack of funds. This raised a perplexing question. Why would the boys return to the same location where they had been turned away earlier, without any money to participate in the activity? While the detectives now had a timeline to work with, there were still gaps in their understanding of the events. It was frustrating for them to be so close to the boys, yet unable to locate them. The atmosphere in the office of Captain Russell Corcoran, head of the 33rd Precinct of the Chicago Police Department, was tense and somber on that fateful day of October 18, 1955. The disappearance of the Peterson and Schussler boys had consumed the entire department, and Captain Corcoran had just reassured the commissioner that they were exerting every effort to locate them. However, at 1:15 p.m., the phone rang once again, and as the captain listened, his face turned pale and tears welled up in his eyes. After hanging up, he made a grim announcement that would forever haunt the team of detectives. The bodies of 3 young boys had been discovered, unclothed. On that day, Victor Livingston, a middle-aged liquor salesman, was leisurely driving around in his car, enjoying the rewards of his hard work. Having earned a decent sum of money, he sought a peaceful spot to have his lunch. Consequently, he decided to visit Robinson Woods Forest Preserve, a picturesque area renowned for birdwatching and autumn foliage on the northwest side of Chicago. Little did he know that he was about to stumble upon something horrifying. As he sat in his car preparing to eat, his attention was drawn to a lifeless body lying on the ground. Alarmed, he swiftly drove away in search of a phone to alert the authorities. Various authorities arrived at the scene as the news spread. When Victor approached the officers inquiring about the body, he was informed that 3 bodies had been found. Due to the bodies being placed in a shallow ditch, only one was visible. Despite the detectives' extensive search for the missing boys, the grim reality they uncovered was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. Just a fortnight before Halloween, the boys were found unclothed and stacked on top of each other, with Robert's head displaying a gruesome wound that had already healed. The contaminated area offered no hope of finding footprints or any other valuable evidence. The devastating news impacted everyone profoundly. Although detectives were expected to maintain a professional demeanor, tears flowed freely that day as they grieved the loss of the innocent children. Left with minimal evidence, the detectives noted the absence of footprints near the bodies, suggesting that the boys had been disposed of from a vehicle. The perpetrator had meticulously covered their tracks, erasing any traces of the boys' belongings or incriminating evidence. Furthermore, the presence of grease on their hands, backs, and soles indicated that the boys were likely killed elsewhere before being dumped in the forest. The absence of blood due to rain further supported this theory. An autopsy on the 3 boys revealed that they had been deceased for approximately 36 to 40 hours before their discovery in the Robinson Woods Forest Preserve. While initial suspicions pointed towards assault, the autopsy results disproved this assumption. Dr. Harry R. Hoffman, an associate of the Cook County Behavior Clinic, somberly pointed out that the individual behind such a despicable act was likely fulfilling their dark desires through the very act itself. Dr. Jerry Kearns was a seasoned professional in the field of examining human remains. He made sure not to let the weight of his work affect his personal life, but the case of the Schussler-Peterson boys would leave an indelible mark. Anton Jr. had been struck in the neck with a force akin to a karate chop, yet the presence of fingernail marks on Anton and John's necks indicated that they were strangled. The Schussler boys seemed to have been strangled using bare hands, while Robert had evidently been strangled with a rope. Additionally, he had been brutally beaten on the head 14 times with a rake or similar gardening tool, and the other boys had been struck on their faces with what seemed to be the flat side of a knife. Coroner Walter E. McCarrow also shared his thoughts on the tragedy, labeling it as the work of a deranged individual or possibly a group of older boys. It was observed that Robert, John, and Anton were likely held captive in unsanitary conditions, bound and silenced with adhesive tape before being discarded in the forest preserve. Dr. Kearns was well aware that this was no ordinary crime. He asserted that it was not carried out by individuals of the same age group, nor was it the work of a lone 18 or 20-year-old. The assailant had approached from the left rear, and despite the gruesome nature of the crime, there was no sign of sexual assault. Robert had put up a fierce fight for his life, evident from the head injuries he sustained. The recovery of the boys' bodies marked just the beginning of the nightmare. Witnesses came forward to report seeing a vehicle pick up the three boys. One witness even claimed the car was a Packard, leading to the interrogation of nearly 1,000 Packard owners. Despite an exhaustive investigation that involved interviewing over 43,000 individuals, the perpetrator remained at large. Anton Schuessler Sr., who had lost his two sons, expressed his thoughts on the tragic events, stating, "When children can't safely go to the movies in the afternoon and return home, there is something fundamentally wrong with the country." However, the tragedy did not end there for the Schuessler family. Anton Sr., at only 41 years old, passed away due to a heart attack just a month after the murders. Eleanor Schuessler's life became even more isolated as she mourned the loss of both her sons and her husband. Despite eventually marrying Valentine Bud Kujawa and attempting to move forward, the memories of the murders continued to haunt her. She kept a photo of her boys and a bronzed baby shoe of each on her dresser as a constant reminder of the children she had lost. For years, she grappled with the unanswered question of what had happened to her sons, with occasional visits from investigators serving as painful reminders of the unsolved case. Gary Kujawa, her stepson, recalled the profound impact the murders had on her, noting that she was always haunted by the tragedy. The Peterson family also struggled to come to terms with their loss. Malcolm, Robert's father, not only mourned the loss of his son, but also his closest companion. Dorothy, Robert's mother, was left so devastated by the tragedy that she required medical attention. In the aftermath of the murders, Chicago became a place of unease. Law enforcement officers scoured the streets tirelessly, searching for any evidence or clues related to the case. Parents were reluctant to let their children out of their sight, fearing they could also become victims of the unknown perpetrators. Leaving children home alone was no longer an option, as doors were securely locked, and even disposing of items in the trash seemed risky, as any suspicious activity could lead to intense questioning by investigators. The community was gripped by fear, with terror infiltrating every aspect of daily life. Despite the disorder, the investigation continued with the presence of numerous uniformed police officers and undercover detectives scouring the neighborhood. Captain Louis Caparelli enlisted an additional 200 officers from his unit, all of whom willingly sacrificed their weekend to aid in the manhunt. It was an unprecedented display of unity within the Chicago Police Department, with one officer commenting, "I've never witnessed anything like it." However, it wasn't until December 7th, 1955, that the Chicago Daily News took notice of peculiar markings discovered on John's left thigh, positioned between his knee and hip. These oval-shaped markings, measuring 4 inches by 2 inches, featured a pattern of stars and letters imprinted on the fatty tissue beneath the skin. Of particular significance was the word bear. Dr. Kearns had overlooked this detail in his initial findings. Yet, there were other crucial oversights as well. Funeral home attendants had uncovered alarming bone fractures in the Schuessler brothers, which Dr. Kearns had failed to detect. Additionally, adhesive tape had covered the boys' faces, but it had been removed prior to their bodies being left in the ditch. The perpetrators of this crime were well aware of what they were doing, concluded Coroner McCarran. They took care to eliminate the tape used for blindfolding and gagging the victims, as it could have revealed fingerprints. The leads that once appeared promising gradually dwindled, transforming the once bustling investigation into a silent and stagnant cold case. The brutal murders of 3 young boys in Chicago left investigators with more questions than answers. As if the case wasn't perplexing enough, over a year later, on December 28, 1956, 2 teenage girls, 15-year-old Barbara Grimes and 13-year-old Patricia Grimes, vanished after watching their beloved movie, Love Me Tender. Their lifeless bodies were discovered unclothed on the side of the road, mirroring the earlier murders. However, unlike the boys, there was no clear cause of death. The coroner's jury ruled that the sisters froze to death, but the chief investigator, Harry G. Lowes, disagreed. He believed that the ice around the bodies showed that they were warm when they were left there, and that the puncture wounds in Patricia's chest were signs of violence before death. He also suspected that Barbara had been assaulted, which the pathologists had denied. The eerie similarities between the two cases led to speculation that the same person might have been responsible for both. After decades of frustration and dead ends, it seemed like the case of the murdered boys in Chicago would remain a mystery forever. But then, in 1994, a bombshell dropped, and it wasn't the kind of evidence you see in TV crime dramas. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no trace evidence examined by a forensics expert. Instead, it was a seemingly innocent comment made by a snitch in a completely unrelated investigation that suddenly opened up a direct path to a suspect in this long-dormant investigation. During an investigation into suspected horse killings and the mysterious disappearance of candy heiress and horsewoman Helen Voorhees Brach on February 17, 1977, a breakthrough occurred when Special Agent Jim Grady and his partner, Mr. Rotuno, began piecing together clues from the horse racing industry. They knew they were entering a world of secrets. As the pieces started to fall into place, the prosecution team found themselves delving into an underworld of murderers, arsonists, swindlers, conmen, and even a group known as the Horse Mafia. As they dug deeper, they started hearing whispers about a man named Kenneth Hansen in relation to the boys' slayings, who had bragged about the incident to the people he was close with. For years, the case was built from fragments of information called from this murky world. But somehow, they managed to make it all fit together, painting a vivid picture of what had happened all those years ago. In the early 1990s, detectives were closing in on Kenneth Hansen, who had a rather eventful life. Born to Ethan and Lucille Hansen in 1933, Kenneth was known for his intelligence and charisma during his childhood. He later married his high school sweetheart, Beverly Ray Carlson, and together they had 2 sons, Danny and Mark. In the 1960s, Kenneth opened and managed a riding stable called Camelot near Tinley Park. It was during this time that Roger Spry, a young worker at the stable, became a part of the Hansen family, residing in their house from a young age. However, things took a dark turn when Hansen made inappropriate advances towards Spry and banished him to sleep with the dogs in the kennels. Eventually, when Spry was still a child, Hansen initiated a relationship with him that lasted for years until Spry turned 18. Throughout this period, Spry lived on and off with Hansen, while Hansen also picked up male hitchhikers aged between 11 and 16 years old, offering them lodging at the stables in exchange for work. Hansen would often boast to Spry about his relations with these young boys. As the summer of 1994 approached, Hansen began to feel the weight of impending doom as the investigation into his possible involvement in a decades-old case closed in on him. He became so paranoid that he started asking his neighbor if there were any police officers looking around his house. Meanwhile, the investigations surrounding the disappearance of Helen Voorhees Brach continued to unfold, adding more intrigue to the situation. In July 1994, the police made a significant move by charging Richard Bailey, a former stable owner and acquaintance of Hansen's, with soliciting Brach's murder. But that was not the end of it. Authorities also charged 23 other individuals for their alleged participation in schemes to kill valuable horses for insurance payments. On August 11, 1994, Kenneth Hansen was apprehended by the Chicago Police and Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms at his residence in Country Club Hills, where he was found with a packed suitcase. The arrest was in connection to an arson incident in 1972 that destroyed the Forest View Stables, a rival business, and resulted in the deaths of 36 horses. The following day, on August 12th, Hansen was formally charged with 3 counts of murder in the Peterson-Schuessler case. At the time of the murders, he was 22 years old, and he was 61 years old at the time of his arrest. The announcement of the murder charges against Hansen raised questions about the evidence authorities had against him. Despite not revealing specific evidence, Cook County State's Attorney, Jack O'Malley, stressed that after 4 decades, the case could not rely solely on physical evidence. This lack of transparency deepened the mystery surrounding the case, leaving many curious about how the prosecution planned to build their case against Hansen. Although Robert Hansen was one of the 43,000 individuals initially interviewed, there is no indication that he was aware of being a suspect or deliberately concealed his involvement from investigators. Police reports suggest that on October 16, 1955, Robert, John, and Anton were hitchhiking on Milwaukee Avenue when they were picked up by Hansen, who resided just a few blocks away from where he encountered the boys. Hansen then transported them to Idle Hour Stables, a location he frequented and worked at on the city's northwest side. According to sources, Hansen attempted to engage in inappropriate behavior with the boys, and when they resisted, the situation turned violent, resulting in the boys' deaths. On that same evening, witness Hetty Salerno heard 2 chilling screams emanating from the direction of the Idle Hour stable while she was going about her activities. Spry, who resided with Hansen's family, testified that Hansen once recounted a chilling incident involving 3 boys he had picked up while they were hitchhiking. According to Hansen's version of events, he took them to a barn where he assaulted Anton. When John, Robert, and Anton threatened to report the incident to their parents and the police, an argument ensued. The defendant ended up accidentally strangling one of the boys in the heat of the moment and was then compelled to eliminate the other 2 to prevent being exposed. After the killings, Hansen's friend showed up, and together they disposed of the bodies in the nearby forest preserves with the help of an employee. Hansen had openly admitted to multiple individuals about the murders, even mentioning how his brother, Curtis Hansen, had attacked one of the boys with a blunt object. Kenneth Hansen lived in constant fear that Curtis might disclose his secrets at any moment. Witnesses during the initial trial testified that Hansen had confessed to them about the killings in a room at the Idle Hour stable. The stable was under the ownership of Silas Jamie, a controversial figure in the horsebreeding world known for his erratic behavior and suspected involvement in violent and shady dealings. Despite this, he managed to climb the ranks in the industry, becoming a prominent figure in the Chicago horse scene. It was believed that Silas somehow learned about the 3 boys being killed in the stable and was outraged. Some witnesses even claimed that he assisted in disposing of the bodies. Hansen bragged that after the bodies were discovered, he relocated to South Chicago and arranged for the Idle Hour stable to be burned down to eliminate any evidence. In 1995, Hansen was found guilty of the atrocious crime, but his fortunes changed when the Illinois Appellate Court overturned his conviction 5 years later. It was determined that the jury should not have been exposed to Hansen's history of inappropriate behavior with boys. Nevertheless, justice prevailed during a retrial in 2002. The jury quickly reached a guilty verdict, leading to Hansen being sentenced to 200 to 300 years in prison, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. Despite appealing the decision in 2004, it was upheld. Kenneth Hansen battled dementia in prison and passed away on September 13, 2007, at the age of 74. The news of his conviction evoked a range of emotions, from relief to anger. One individual deeply impacted was a stepbrother of the Schuessler brothers, whose pain resurfaced upon learning of Hansen's death. Leonard Goodman, Hansen's former attorney, maintained his client's innocence, believing that an earlier arrest could have provided a solid alibi. However, with decades past, recalling specific details from 1955 was impossible. Prosecutors and investigators argued that the evidence against Hansen was strong, labeling the case as a deadlock. They also alleged that Hansen had victimized numerous boys leading up to his arrest. The Peterson-Schuessler murder case transcended a mere crime, becoming a chilling tale that instilled fear and unease throughout the city. Once a peaceful community, it transformed into a place where darkness was dreaded and the unknown was feared.
Summer camp was approaching, and Nicky Verstappen was still not sure if he really wanted to go or not. The year before, he did not go because he was scared of getting homesick, and his parents supported his decision to stay back home. Nicky Verstappen preferred to spend summers at home in the town of harrowing in the south of the Netherlands. That way, he could always go to visit friends, play games with his younger sister, Femke, or cuddle and love up to his dog. He would always miss his dog any time he left home for the summer camp. In the summer of 1998, even though Nicky Verstappen felt unsure about going to summer camp, he still felt that he had to go. He felt he was not 10 years old anymore. He was 11 years and was growing up. After he told his mother that he was not too sure about summer camp, she encouraged him and said that once he was there, he would have a lot of fun. Since his best friend was going too, Nicky felt everything would be okay. After concluding to go, Nicky Verstappen began to pack his necessities, not forgetting to include his favorite red and white pajamas, which was an official merchandise for AFAC Ajax, his favorite soccer team from Amsterdam. It was gifted to him as a Christmas present because of his love for anything that had to do with Ajax logo and colors. In fact, most of Nicky Verstappen's room was designed with everything Ajax from color red to white. The day of summer camp came and Nicky picked up his bag, looked at his room for the last time, and left. Sadly, he would never get to see the poster of Jerry Litmanen hanging against the wall of his room ever again. Nicky Verstappen was born on the 13th of March 1987 to Peter and Bertie Verstappen in harrowing in the district of Limburg, the Netherlands. He had a loving family and was the eldest of 2 children. Nicky and his younger sister, Femke, loved to play together. Nicky, who lived in a small community of 800 people, would frequently cycle all over his hometown of Blum. This made many people know him. He was described as friendly and a laid-back young kid. He was also known to be a happy and well-adjusted young man. His mother described him as spontaneous and sporty. At the time, when people think of Nicky Verstappen, it was hard not to recollect the Amsterdam soccer team, Ajax. Nicky was practically a die-hard fan who would never miss a match. Nicky was said to have played soccer himself, and he also was known to be a good player. The annual summer camp for the 8 to 12 years olds came, and on Saturday, the 8th of August 1998, Nicky Verstappen and 36 other schoolchildren from his school took the bus on a 45-minute journey from Blum to the town of Brunsum in order to take part in the children's summer camp being held on the De Heikop camping grounds on the Brunsummerheide. It was known that every kid from harrowing had the opportunity to attend this summer camp every year. Nicky Verstappen, who had encouraged himself to go because of his best friend, got a bit disappointed when his best friend pulled out and decided to stay back home at the last minute. Nicky, however, decided to still go for the summer camp. He stayed on the bus as he waved his friend goodbye. On arrival at the De Heikop camping grounds, the children were divided into their various tent groups. All 37 kids were split into 10 tents, while the 4 remaining tents were shared among the 12 camp leaders. According to camp tradition, each group had to name their tents. The name was also the name of their team. Nicky Verstappen's tent, which he shared with 4 other boys his age who were his friends, was named Night Riders. Just like his mother promised, the first day of summer camp was a lot of fun with games and team-building activities. Later that night, they all gathered around a campfire while one of the leaders narrated scary ghost stories. Around 10 p.m., the kids were sent to bed while the camp leaders stayed up until midnight eating and drinking. Summer camp started off on a great path. Everyone retired to their tents for the night, feeling happy with the anticipation of a more exciting day, as there were a lot of fun-filling activities planned for the following day. Around 5 a.m. on the 10th of August 1998, one of Nicky Verstappen's tent mates woke up to go use the toilet. At that time, the remaining tent mates, including Nicky, were still sleeping. Around 6 a.m., another kid from the Night Riders tent woke up and realized Nicky Verstappen was gone. Their initial thoughts was that he had gone to the toilet. However, 2 hours later, at 8 a.m., when the trumpet for breakfast time was played, and Nicky had not still returned, his tent mates became worried. They then told their camp leaders that Nicky had gone out of their tent since 6 a.m. and had not returned. Everyone at the campsite, including the campers and camp leaders, started looking for Nicky Verstappen all over the campsite. They searched for him and called out his name numerous times, but he could not be found. Since Nicky Verstappen had been unsure of coming to summer camp, the leaders thought that he had ran away. His parents in Hybloem were then called and told that he had disappeared from the campsite and his whereabouts could not be located. This came as a shock to Nicky's parents. His mother, Bertie Verstappen, sensed something was wrong. To her, she knows her son would never opt and leave the camp without informing anyone, since he was quite nervous about going away from home in the first place. It did not make any sense that he would go off on his own. Bertie and Peter then quickly left Hybloem and traveled down to the campsite to look for their son. When they got to the campsite, Bertie noticed that Nicky's shoes were still in the tent. She felt if he had planned to run away, definitely he would have worn his shoes. Nicky's parents then joined the camp leaders to search all over the campsite, desperately calling Nicky's name, but unfortunately there was no answer. By midday, they came to a conclusion to call in the police. Later that afternoon, the search party had grown significantly. There was a massive turnout of volunteers, which were mostly friends and family from Hybloem, as well as from the local town of Brunsum. They took turns to wait at Nicky's tent and to go out and look for Nicky in the surrounding bushes and fields. The search party frantically looked for Nicky. The police, to a great extent, interrogated all the camp leaders and went to all the homes surrounding the campsite to ask if residents had maybe come across an 11-year-old boy, but it didn't yield anything. Even though Nicky's family insisted that something was seriously wrong, the search party had no real sense of panic. The only general feeling they had was that Nicky Verstappen had left the campsite by himself and had got lost in the woods. They believed he was okay and were expecting him to be found alive and well. The day of the search appeared to have been one of the hottest days of the whole summer of 1998. It was 95 degrees and it made the search even more exhausting. Camp leaders took turns to look for Nicky, while others kept the kids at the campsite occupied with activities. In the evening, armed forces were contacted to join in the search, while the kids were sent to their tents like nothing happened. While they slept, the military vehicles and searchers frantically called out Nicky's name into the darkness of the night. By the next morning, on Tuesday, Nicky was still nowhere to be found, so the camp leaders felt there was no need for camping anymore if one of them was lost. They then decided to cancel the camp. Every kid was placed in a bus and taken back home to Hybloem, while the search party intensified their search efforts. The more they searched for Nicky Verstappen, the more it became clear that he didn't run away. The police used their dogs for the search as well, and an aerial search of the campsite was done using a plane. All efforts to find Nicky yielded no results, and by sunset, the search party was running out of daylight. Finally, around 9 p.m. on Tuesday, the 11th of August 1998, Nicky Verstappen's uncle, who was part of the search party, noticed something laying underneath a small pine tree. On getting closer, he saw the lifeless body of 11-year-old Nicky Verstappen. Nicky was found in a pine grove on the Shinveldeweg in Landgraaf, less than a mile away from the campsite. He was wearing his red Ajax pajama pants and blue underpants, and was naked from the waist up. His pajamas pants, which he got as a Christmas present from the previous year, were turned inside out and the front was placed to the back. Nicky had sustained a wound to his head, but at first glance, the wound did not look serious enough to have caused his death. Even though he was found in a pine grove, close to farmlands and bushes, Nicky's feet were clean. He seemed like he did not walk to the place where he was found. People believed that he was killed somewhere else, and his body was carried down to the place he was found. The spot Nicky Verstappen was found was near a parking lot that was known for where homosexual men would meet for secret sex. Aside that, movement around that area was limited. By midnight, Nicky Verstappen's body was taken to a mortuary in Maastricht, about 30 minutes away from the campsite. The people of Heibloem came together to assist Nicky's family in arranging a memorial service for him. The memorial service took place at Heibloem Sports Fields on Saturday, the 15th of August, 1998, a week after he left home for summer camp. Since Nicky was wildly known in Heibloem, 600 people attended his funeral. His love for Ajax was recognized at his funeral. His coffin was covered with the red Ajax flag, which was something he would have loved. His family would never remain the same again as they were left in a state of shock and grief. Nicky's parents felt guilty for encouraging their son to go for summer camp, even when he confided in them that he was unsure of the trip. Who killed Nicky Verstappen? His family wanted answers and closure. Somebody needed to be held accountable for killing their son and brother, but the police had no leads whatsoever. Seeing that it was unlikely for Nicky to have gone off with a stranger, the police interviewed the camp leaders again. Unfortunately, nothing that could help solve the case was discovered. Nicky's post-mortem examination took place 3 days after his death. Since he was murdered in the summer of the holiday period, Nicky's family had to wait for 2 months before the results of the autopsy was released. According to the autopsy report, Nicky Verstappen was drugged and his body showed signs of sexual abuse. However, medical examiner was unable to determine a cause of death. Due to this, a second autopsy was carried out, and its result had the same conclusion with the first. There was a possibility that Nicky was sexually assaulted, but his cause of death could not be determined. Even though suffocation was suggested as his cause of death, there was not enough evidence to prove it once and for all. Following Nicky's murder, an extensive investigation was carried out, but the case went cold and would remain unsolved for 20 years. The police had to use the evidence they have. Close to the parking lot, about 100 yards from where Nicky Verstappen was found, a tissue containing semen, a cigarette butt and beer bottle top were retrieved. The forensics then compiled a DNA profile of a person other than Nicky. Though it was not definite that the tissue was related to Nicky's murder case, since people often met in the parking lot and have sex in the woods. In 1997, a year before Nicky Verstappen's murder, a DNA database was created at the National Forensics Institute of the Netherlands. At the time, DNA testing was the new forensic technology and tests were a little bit restricted. Also, any DNA testing on the database could only be handled by the prosecutor and not the police. At that time, the police did not have their own database and they did not have first-hand access to the national database without an approval from the prosecutor. This made the process of quickly finding a killer somewhat slow and difficult. During the investigation of Nicky Verstappen's murder, DNA samples of 40 men were taken. The men included camp leaders, some men from a campsite nearby and other male visitors in the area at the time of Nicky's death. However, none of the DNA matched the profile found in the tissue at the crime scene. Even if the retrieved tissue with semen was probably a leftover of a sexual encounter that had nothing to do with Nicky's death, the investigators still could not strike out the evidence. Later in the investigation, there was a glimmer of hope when a single hair, similar in color to that of Nicky's, was found in the trunk of a car which belonged to one of the camp leaders. After the hair sample was sent to the UK for DNA testing, it was however discovered that it did not belong to Nicky. Immediately the autopsy results were out. The first person of interest was Jos Barton, an 80-year-old founder of the camp Nicky and his classmates went. Jos Barton was the former principal of Nicky's school in Heibloem. He had lost his job after he was convicted of child sexual abuse in the 1950s. During interrogation, he had also confessed that he was near Nicky Verstappen's tent at 6 a.m. on the morning of his disappearance. But he did not go there for Nicky. He said he went there to check on one of the boys who had burnt his hand the night before. Jos Barton's alibi was that when he woke up at 5 a.m., he cleaned his tent and then went to check on the boy who burnt his hand, after which he then drove back to Heibloem to attend the funeral of a friend who had died. He claimed to have heard about Nicky Verstappen's disappearance at the funeral and went straight back to the camp. Juice Barton was on the police radar for some time, and this was because he exhibited strange behavior during the search for Nicky Verstappen. He kept steering the search in the direction of the place where Nicky's body was found. He also gave the information that the parking lot near the crime scene was a place where men often meet for sex. The police was uncomfortable about Juice Barton. They decided to look into his background. Even though he was a respected member of his community, he had been convicted for child sexual assault and was imprisoned for 3 months before he was let go and allowed to work with kids again. Several years later, photos of young boys who were shirtless or in their underpants were discovered on him, though there were no proofs that he further molested any male child at the time. However, after Nicky Verstappen's death, a 15-year-old girl came forward and said that she had every reason to believe Juice Barton had sexually molested her when she attended summer camp earlier that year in 1998. She claimed she was unwell one evening and Juice Barton had given her medication that turned out to be sleeping drugs for adults. She said when she woke up, her clothes were messy and different from the way they were when she went to bed. The girl also claimed to have experienced lower abdominal pain and discomfort. The police, however, could not do anything about her confession since she did not report the incident earlier. After much interrogation, Juice Barton could not be arrested due to lack of sufficient evidence to pin him to the kidnapping and murder of Nicky Verstappen. A reward of 250,000 guilders was offered for any lead that could bring the suspect to justice. As time went, Nicky's family became frustrated as they sensed lack of urgency in solving their son's murder. They resorted to a well-known television crime reporter at the time, Peter DeVries, and asked him to help them to solve the mystery surrounding their son's death. Peter DeVries agreed to help them look into the case. Over the years, his involvement in the case turned out to be a salvation for Nicky's family. Peter DeVries launched a campaign on behalf of the Verstappen's family, and the reward money was doubled to 500,000 guilders by unknown business people. In April 1999, the first in-depth documentary about Nicky's murder case was broadcast nationally. The documentary talked about Juice Barton's child sexual assault in the past. It brought up questions like, why was he allowed to work with children after being a convicted sex offender? The documentary seemed to put pressure on the police to investigate Juice Barton further. This divided the small community of Hybloem. Nicky's case threatened to tear the community apart. While some people wanted to protect the founder of the camp, some people supported Nicky's family in their quest to find out the truth, even if it meant asking confronting questions. As time went by, majority of the people in Hybloem chose to stay away from Nicky's family. They believed the Verstappens were out on a witch hunt. Nicky's family only held on to a handful of faithful friends who supported them through the case. In July of 1999, Nicky Verstappen's case was ruled unsolved. The next month, in August, Bertie and Peter Verstappen had an opportunity to meet with Queen Beatrix, the former Queen of the Netherlands. They handed her a letter, which was an official complaint about the slow investigation in the death of their son. Due to this, efforts were subsequently intensified by the prosecutor in Maastricht to solving the case. In 2001, Nicky's grandparents and the town of Brunsum silently built a monument for Nicky at the spot where his body was found. This didn't make Nicky's parents feel any better. His mother, Bertie, would always light a candle in their family home every morning as soon as she woke up. She did this for 20 years. In an interview with Peter DeVries, she said, "I wake up at night and hear his voice. He calls me. I get up and go to look for Nicky, but he is no longer there." Their happy and complete family of 4 had become an unhappy, incomplete and broken family of 3. Since answers were not forthcoming at the time, Bertie, who did not let that stop her, had promised on national TV to bring the killer of her child to justice as long as she was still alive. In February of 2001, Bertie and Peter Verstappen wrote a public letter to the Minister of Justice, asking for help on their son's case. They claim to be at the mercy of the police and the legal systems, but they have no answers. The legal system then decided to act as there appeared to have been a total breakdown in trust by the people of Heilbronn. The general public were getting disappointed at the police and the legal systems for not giving answers as to who killed Nicky Verstappen. In that same year, the case was renewed and a second opinion task force was given the case to investigate from scratch. On the 29th of June 2001, the investigative team was able to determine the time of Nicky's death. His time of death was estimated to have been between 2 p.m. on the 10th of August or 9 a.m. on the 11th of August. It means Nicky Verstappen was alive for at least 8 hours before he was murdered. New DNA technology also discovered that there were little drops of blood on Nicky's pajamas. One of the drops was tested for foreign DNA, but it turned out to be that of Nicky. Further investigation revealed many mistakes made by the first set of investigators that made the case become cold for some time. One of the mistakes was that these investigators focused on the scene where Nicky was found. They used that spot as the crime scene, forgetting that Nicky's feet were clean when he was found, which suggested that he did not walk to that place himself. He was carried away from the main crime scene and dumped at the spot he was found. The first investigation did not look for possible evidence beyond the pine tree where Nicky was found. Even the campsite where Nicky was last seen was not properly considered for possible clues that could pinpoint the killer. As time unfolds, Juice Barton was not the only suspects in the case. In 1998, at the time that Nicky and his friends were camping, there appeared to have been another group from the Rolduc Seminary who pitched their tents nearby. A man named Rolduc's chef had piqued the interest of the police, and this was because he had once had an inappropriate contact with a child before. They believed he was someone who would do it again. On the morning of Nicky Verstappen's disappearance, Rolduc's chef was not at the campsite. When questioned, he appeared to have no alibi for his whereabouts at the time. However, he died in 1999 before the police could find enough evidence to arrest him. Also, a man simply known as Wim was another person of interest at the time. Wim was a sex offender from a town nearby. Different witnesses spotted him near the Hikop campsite in a dark-colored vehicle around August 10, 1998. He was questioned by the police in 2001, 2003, 2006, and 2007, anytime a witness came forward pointing a finger at him. Unfortunately, there was no sufficient evidence to pin him to the crime, and in 2007, he died at the age of 64. Until his death, Wim had said he never killed Nicky Verstappen. Martin Nee, the German serial killer, was someone the police could not afford to overlook in this case. He had killed 3 boys and had sexually molested at least 40 children between 1992 and 2001. Martin Nee was known as the Masked Man or the Black Man, and this is because he used to wear black clothing and a creepy black mask. His victims were usually hunted by him at campsites or in children's homes. Since the Hikop campsite was located close to the Dutch-German border and one of Nee's proven crimes was committed in the Netherlands, he was considered as a serious suspect. However, when he was eventually arrested for all his crimes in 2001, Martin Nee denied any involvement in Nicky Verstappen's murder. As the investigation progresses, the police had quite a number of suspects on their list. The likes of Michel Fournier and Mark Hoffman, who were sex offenders at the time, were considered suspects to Nicky Verstappen's homicide case, but thorough investigation vindicated them, and they were never charged with his murder. In 2004, Peter de Vries became aware of new testing techniques in the science of DNA. He then informed the public and told the police to re-examine the blood found on Nicky Verstappen's clothing. In 2005, an anonymous person placed letters on Nicky's memorial in Bronsum, claiming to have been responsible for killing him. Investigators traced the letters to a 36-year-old man, but it turned out to be a false confession. The man was a psychiatric patient who had severe mental health issues. His therapist explained that he had written the letters as a way of getting attention. The man was placed in custody for 2 weeks for vandalizing Nicky Verstappen's grave. In 2008, When it seemed like all hope was lost, detectives announced that foreign DNA had been found on Nicky's pajamas pants and his underpants. Previous suspects in the case were all retested, but there were still no matches to the DNA found. Nevertheless, Nicky's family was positive. It might seem like another dead end, but the discovery of the foreign DNA profile meant there was proof of a male individual being in physical contact with Nicky Verstappen before his death. Nicky's family prayed and hoped that the perpetrator would be found before he could hurt any other person. In the year 2010, Nicky Verstappen's sister, Femke, who was in her 20s by then, made a public appeal to every man in the community to participate in a DNA testing so that the family could have some sense of closure. After the appeal, the police gathered a list of over 100 men. These men were initially part of the search party and camp management. 80 out of 114 men agreed to provide saliva swabs. Even though it was quite a high number of turnouts for the DNA analysis, Peter de Vries took to the media again to encourage people to be partakers of the DNA tests. It seemed a lot of these men were scared of leaving their DNA samples because they do not want to be caught for a past crime. However, after Peter de Vries explained that their DNAs would only be used for the Nicky Verstappen's case, additional 40 men came forward. After carrying out a comprehensive test on the retrieved DNA samples, there was still no match to the DNA found on Nicky's clothing. In a desperate attempt to find the truth, the remains of Juice Barton, who had died in 2003, were exhumed for testing. There was hope at that point since Juice Barton had been the strongest suspect throughout the years. However, many people became surprised when the DNA of Juice Barton did not match the DNA found on Nicky Verstappen's clothes. In the early days of 2012, Nicky Verstappen's homicide case was transferred to a cold case team. The new investigators went through Nicky's case file from the very beginning to end. After that, they located a group of 1,500 males, all of whom had ties to the region near the campsite where Nicky Verstappen was last seen. The individuals on the list were either camp employees, residents of the neighborhood, or officially charged sex offenders. But once again, they were out of luck. The police did not give up easily. They renewed their request for public assistance in 2017. They requested over 20,000 DNA samples in order to perform kinship analysis. By this, investigators would have more information about the killer's relatives, which would greatly reduce the scope of their search. In the long run, only 15,000 volunteers participated. However, the size of this DNA dragnet operation was unprecedented in Dutch history. Given that there was nothing more to be done, it was a long shot, but also the last option. Bulk DNA sweeping is a significant project, and numerous ethical issues have been brought up in relation to it. Most people believe that cooperating was a no-brainer if they had nothing to conceal, and their DNA profile may help investigators identify the killer of a young child. Authorities sent mails to all the men requesting new DNA samples. Police would attempt to persuade them to assist if there were no answers from them by visiting them at home. One of the men, named Jos Brecht, who was supposed to provide a sample, did not show up. 2 police officers went to his house, but he wasn't there. The man, according to his relatives, traveled to France in February of 2012 and did not return. Jos Brecht's family reported him missing in April. He had vanished from his home and presumably ran away before the police could find him and extract his DNA. Authorities investigated this man's past to learn who he was because they had concerns about him. When Nicky Verstappen was killed, Jos Brecht was 35 years old. He resided in Simpelveld with his mother, which is about 12 miles from the campsite. He was a committed scout member and frequently served as a camp leader as well. He had also spent some years providing childcare in Brunsum. He had once been involved in a case of sexual abuse of 2 10-year-old boys in 1985. Despite making a confession to the crime, he was not found guilty. He only got a 2-year probationary period, and his name was never added to the list of sex offenders. That was why he evaded detection when local police conducted a DNA search of all sex offenders. His name was never mentioned. On August 10, 1998, Jos Brecht was in the immediate area of Nicky's disappearance. Around midnight on Tuesday, August 11, 1998, police stopped him while he was cycling on a road close to the crime site. Few hours before he was seen by the police, Nicky Verstappen's corpse had just been discovered, and at the time the police saw Jos Brecht, Nicky's body was being transported from the campsite to Maastricht for the autopsy. When the cops questioned him about why he was out cycling at that time, Jos Brecht responded that he was delivering letters to Scout members because it was too hot to have done so during the day. The explanation seemed reasonable to the officers because that particular day had been very hot. However, when he was questioned later during investigation, he provided a different explanation. Child pornography was discovered on his personal computer in August 1998, the same month when Nicky Verstappen was murdered. But once again, Jos Brecht only got a warning. One of the 15,000 DNA samples provided to authorities during the bulk DNA search in 2017 revealed a close match to the foreign DNA found on Nicky Verstappen. The DNA sample belonged to a relative of the individual whose DNA was found on Nicky's clothes. That person happened to be related to the missing Jos Brecht. In order to create a DNA profile, police asked Jos Brecht's family if he had left behind a hairbrush or toothbrush as they were getting closer to solving the case. His family assisted the authorities and provided them with some of his personal belongings. Finally, after 20 painful long years, all the effort paid off. At the start of June 2018, the forensics discovered a 100 perfect match between Jos Brecht's DNA and the DNA found on Nicky's pajamas and underpants. Detectives were, however, requested to keep the new information to themselves in order to avoid alerting the offender. The investigators now began a massive global search for Jos Brecht. Jos Brecht's last known location was in the Vosges mountain region of northern France, where he served as a survival expert who guided nature expeditions into the mountains. Keep in mind that he was an experienced scout member who knew what he was doing. When Jos Brecht departed the Vosges, no one knew where he had gone because he had not used his credit cards or his phone. Police discovered that he had improved his survival skills and had made preparations to vanish and live off the grid. His computer search history demonstrated that he was well prepared because he had done extensive study on small towns throughout Europe, places where Dutch news would not be reported. According to law enforcement, the only way to get him out of his hiding spot was to ask the public for assistance. On August 22, 2018, they revealed at a press conference that DNA samples from Jos Brecht's personal items matched the DNA discovered on Nicky Verstappen's clothing. They also disclosed his name and current age. Due to privacy laws in the Netherlands and the rule that everyone is considered innocent until proven guilty, it is customary to only use the first letter of a surname. However, this instance was unique because it required assistance from law officials to find Jos Brecht. The public appeal worked because, the week following the press conference, a Dutch resident of northern Spain who had seen Jos Brecht's picture in the newspaper recognized him and called the police to report his whereabouts. Jos Brecht was living in a tent next to a commune house in the village of Castellterçol, north of Barcelona. 20 years after Nicky Verstappen's death, on August 26, 2018, Jos Brecht was taken into custody. The passport he had with him at the time of his arrest served as proof of his name. He was returned to the Netherlands on September 6, 2018, and appeared in court for the first time in December 2018. Peter de Vries rejoiced with Nicky Verstappen's family following the arrest of Jos Brecht. There was a strong feeling of relief and accomplishment. Jos Brecht had been questioned in 2001 regarding his presence close to the crime scene on the night Nicky's body was discovered, and he had confessed to child molestation in the past. In his words, he said, "Yes, I can imagine why you'd want to speak to me, because I have had some brushes with the law in the past, in connection with child abuse." This statement was not followed up on or a DNA sample taken. Jos Brecht was not on the sex offenders list, but he had effectively placed himself on it. This case would have been long solved if only the police had thoroughly looked into Jos Brecht back then. In December 2018, the trial commenced in Maastricht. Jos Brecht was charged with manslaughter rather than murder. Manslaughter is a less serious charge. There isn't enough evidence to prove that the murder was premeditated, as there would be in a murder case. Jos Brecht pled not guilty in court and defended himself, saying his DNA was found on Nicky's clothing because when he was walking close to the edge of a forest back at the camp area, he saw something in the distance and went to look out of curiosity, only for him to find Nicky's body. He said that he had checked for signs of life, brushed leaves off the body, and then left without any other action because of his previous convictions. However, the prosecutor argued that a total of 27 traces of Jos Brecht's DNA had been found on Nicky's body, including on his underwear. Jos Brecht still maintained his innocence, saying he had no idea how his DNA ended up on Nicky's underwear. After trial, Jos Brecht was found guilty, and on the 28th of January 2022, an appeal court convicted him on a charge of manslaughter and sentenced him to 16 years imprisonment. Will Nicky Verstappen's family ever find satisfaction, even though they may have some answers? Their son will always be 11 years old, even as his peers age and progress through life. Every day, they are plagued by countless unanswered questions, such as, would Nicky have grown up to realize his goal of playing professional soccer? They are wounded, and they no longer believe in people. Femke Verstappen continues her mother's custom of lighting a candle for Nicky each day and keeping fresh flowers around the house, even though she is an adult with a kid of her own.